Well, we're back here at the Hall of History. Today we're looking at Manifest Destiny and really the crisis that ensued. Now we're looking at the time frame after the War of 1812 up into a few years before the American Civil War. So a fairly short time period in American history. Manifest Destiny was the idea that the United States was meant, and people from the United States were meant to occupy the land between the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. Not a hard concept to fathom. Lewis and Clark went out there. Once they got out there and brought back the stories of the land and possible riches out there, people were going to go out there. There was really no way you're going to stop them. And the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific, two natural boundaries, and it's really not hard to conceive that people would want to fill up that territory between the two oceans. And so this whole idea of manifest destiny was put forth. How did manifest destiny affect the United States? Well, you think about it. People were going to go out there, and no matter what happened, Americans were going to go into that land. And so the Western migration, Texas and the Western territories. Texas was an independent nation. Unfortunately, we don't have a ton of time to get into Texas history, starting into the Alamo and everything. But Texas finally votes to join the United States in 1836. In 1844, Oregon is claimed by multiple nations. Well, it was finally annexed or took over by the United States. In February of 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo between the U.S. and Mexico really gave the United States all of California and the southwest part of the United States. You see on here the Gadsden Purchase, and if I remember correctly, it had to do with running a railroad through that particular area. What crisis did Western migration draw the United States? The whole idea of popular sovereignty, as we looked at the Revolutionary War, people wanted to govern themselves, and we still do. They didn't want the government interfering on their business. And so these areas could vote whether they wanted to be free or they wanted to be a slave state. And slavery was a predominant issue. There was no two ways about it. That was everybody's topic. In 1850, the U.S. is comprised of 15 free and 15 slave states. Nice 50-50 balance between the two. Even at this early time, slave states threatened secession if new states admitted outlawing the practice. They were worried about, as the government increased, the more free states you would have. I think they knew the writing was on the wall that slavery was definitely not something that was going to continue in the United States. How did the United States alleviate the crisis? Well, again, you had this whole political expediency to avert this crisis. And in 1850, California is admitted to the Union as a free state, so we got California way out here. Popular sovereignty would determine slavery or free in the Utah and New Mexico territory. The Texas border dispute with New Mexico was resolved, and Texas received $10 million for the land loss. And this is I always find this kind of interesting. Slave trade, but not slavery, was abolished in Washington, D.C. So you couldn't trade, but if you had slaves, you could still own the slaves. The fugitive slave laws were adapted. And again, you can probably imagine this was put forth more by the southern than the northern states. The compromise map of 1850, we'll look at this a little bit more next week, but you can definitely see the agricultural area down south here versus the northeast and the Midwest. And it's kind of interesting. You got the two free states or territories out in the far west. Well, the nation's response to the Compromise Act, nobody was happy about it. That's about all there is to say on that. And the Fugitive Slave Act also. Northern abolitionists openly defied the acts practicing civil disobedience. There was this whole underground railroad that was transport runaway slaves to freedom in the north and into Canada. Where P.F. Chang's is, right in that area, there was an old barn there off the East Beltline, and that old barn was actually a stop on the Underground Railroad. So it did have stops in Michigan. You think of Detroit, again, near the the Canadian border, many of the slaves went to Canada. The press, books. Uncle Tom's Cabin was published, and it detailed the horrors of slavery. The Kansas Nebraska Act, and this one ended up really causing a lot of trouble. So Nebraska would be admitted to the U.S. as a free state, and Kansas would be admitted as a slave state. They wanted to keep that balance, in government and Congress. Well, what ended up happening, this whole idea, what was called Bleeding Kansas. It says as Kansas prepared to join the United States, abolitionists and pro-slavery groups engaged in really open armed combat. And there was a lot of people got killed in Kansas. And that's where the whole idea of Bleeding Kansas came from. And probably the leader of this whole group was John Brown. And you can read this here, murdered pro-slavery citizens and even attacked and captured the U.S. Army arsenal at Harper's Ferry. I had the opportunity when I was upstate New York where John Brown was buried, and he is still seen as a hero for the anti-slavery. Brown was convicted of murder, treason, and larceny and sentenced to death, and he became a martyr for the abolitionist cause. John Brown was a very, I guess you want to say, charismatic individual, and but he did attack the arsenal, so that was treason against the United States, and he was rightly so convicted for that. Why were the Kansas Nebraska Act and John Brown influential? Well, this was the first time that the nation was so divided on an issue. That people were killing each other. You think about United States where one U.S. citizen was killing another U.S. citizen over an issue. Both the pro-slavery and anti-slavery sides of the U.S. really began to accumulate massive amounts of arms for a coming conflict. I think at this time, people knew it was going to really, the pot was going to boil, it was going to come to a head, and there was probably going to be some type of armed conflict between the two sides. And that's where we will leave it today.